Welcome to Over the Target, a Washington Examiner show about all the investigations, stories, salacious sagas in DC and beyond. I am Chris Irvin, the managing editor of the Washington Examiner. Today I'm joined, as always, by Sarah Bedford, our investigations editor, and Kaylin Deese, our Department of Justice reporter. It's been a massive week for topics that are very near and dear to our heart. The whole reason that we started this show was to take a close look at the Joe Biden Autopen investigation. It's kind of morphed into something a little bit more fluid over the months that we've done it. But Autopen was our first love, essentially. All came to a head this week on Tuesday morning when the House Oversight Committee released its long-awaited report on their findings into the mental decline of Joe Biden and whether there was a cover-up, who was using the auto pen, and kind of who was to blame. I think, Sarah, why don't I start with you? The initial report and the stuff that came with it, on its face, seems pretty damning for the kind of conduct of the Biden administration in its final days, or perhaps even its final year and beyond. What was your kind of initial snap reaction to it as it came out?
Well, I think there was a lot of focus on the House Oversight Committee investigation for so long because it was the only game in town in terms of looking into the auto pen use. And so speaking for myself, sort of had an expectation that maybe this would resolve the issue and get us some kind of answer. But reading the report, it seems like the Oversight Committee investigation was maybe more of a starting point for what could be at this point a DOJ investigation that could turn criminal. That's unclear. It's unclear, in addition, if DOJ would be the one to litigate the legality of executive orders like pardons through a civil process, not a criminal process. That is another possibility that we're looking at here. It's sort of similar to, in stay with me for a second, it's kind of similar to the problem that Democrats had after January 6th. They looked at what happened and they said, wow, this is so dirty. This has to be illegal. Let's go find a way to make it illegal. And with the auto pen, I think there's a sense among Republicans that like it's just got to be illegal to forge the president's signature or cover up the fact that the president's brain is soup. But it's not clear exactly what criminal statutes that they violated, if that is
Right.
in fact what they did, and the Oversight Committee provided evidence that it was indeed the case. So the expectation that we might see people put in handcuffs for this, I don't think that is the goal and the most likely outcome.
Mm.
I think a lot has been made, obviously, of who was kind of calling the shots on the auto pen. Yeah, sorry, I hate using auto pen as shorthand here. Obviously, it's something that I've been at pains to say. Let's not get distracted by the auto pen, and here I find myself saying it. But basically, the pardon power and coming down to
Hmm.
who is making these decisions. And there's been a huge focus, I think, in particular on the clemency decisions for who's kind of calling the shots there. Kaylin, is there anything revelatory that's kind of come out in this report, maybe with regards to paper trail or this idea, not to use Sarah's statement that the president's brain was soup, but
Mm.
of was there somebody pulling the strings here, and does that kind of say everything about how involved or uninvolved Joe Biden was?
Yeah, a couple of things on that. I think that the House Oversight Committee had to make its referral of its report to the DOJ because there ultimately were some things that, through the hours of interviews that they conducted with 14 separate people from Biden's camp, they were never able to actually get any straight answer or straight evidence that they could provide about paper trails for showing that the president assented to the use of the auto pin. So I think that that's one part of this is that the DOJ is needed at this point because the DOJ has broader subpoena power and authority if they feel like there's more need there to actually ascertain who was, who has the receipts for the chain of command that was gone through in order to print the president's name on whether it be a clemency act, a pardon, or an executive order. Now, something that's even more important too, I think, is that the Biden camp acknowledges that not every single thing that the president signed was an open, public, much like how we see President Trump doing. And many times he's in the Oval Office, he's signing things, he's making a big show of it. The Biden camp acknowledges that, and they also defend the fact that there are many times that Biden did sign things in public, but they also, like I said, they know that there were times whenever that wasn't documented on camera. So right now, I get the sense from their camp is that they're thinking, how are we going to potentially comply with the DOJ if we ever get a request to show, this proper trail? I think it's an open question about whether they even have that. And when it comes to what the DOJ can actually do here, I think that there's a couple of things that we need to consider, before we get, really like wild and rambunctious about what could actually happen. I spoke to constitutional law professor Jonathan Adler, who really seems to believe that there is not a whole lot of clarity here on what the DOJ can do. So going back to what Sarah was stating about how there's no clear statutory violation cited. When it comes to clemency and the president's pardon powers, it is very broad. I mean, we've even seen, Trump, in many occasions, say, well, I'll think about pardoning someone. Maybe I am going to pardon someone. It really is a highly discretionary tool that can be used. And it's really something that's hard to question. But the one thing that I do believe there is a route to question is the fact that, whenever you look at the text of the president's pardon abilities, there has to be a admission or a concession that the person being pardoned committed, or being pardoned or committed the act, or committed a crime. Like there has to be something actually there. So when you're talking about the preemptive pardons for people like General Milley, Anthony Fauci, that in and of itself was an unprecedented act. We'd never seen preemptive pardons before. And I think that that is precisely where there is room for scrutiny and for this DOJ to take a look and see if that was even something legal, or as what James Comer is saying, he's using the phrase null and void.
Mm.
As far as executive orders go, I mean, that's something that's a little bit of a distraction for me personally, because whatever, we saw in the first week that Trump came into office, so many of his executive orders invalidated the executive orders of the previous administration. So the idea that a president can sign an executive order that's overriding a previous one, you can't go back and change the past. I mean, we've already done many things to try to undo what the Biden administration did as far as its policies go. So I just don't really see the executive order thing being that big of an issue. But preemptive pardons, I think, is where the DOJ is going to be focusing their attention on.
Yeah, so I agree with you there on the kind of undoing of the executive orders, and yeah, as you say, you can just kind of go over that, and policy is no longer policy. Um, that gets into another debate about how powerful executive orders are, especially when you have a Congress that doesn't really seem too bothered about checks and balances. But that's a story for another day. Um, what I'm One of the things that I keep tripping up over, and I think we have discussed it in the past, was the how how much how in the detail, like the devil's in the detail. How much was Biden aware of what was kind of going on? And the reason I keep coming back to the clemency ones is because we know that he didn't know who absolutely everybody was that was on the list. And I think, as their saying goes, it was kind of rough guidelines of sentencing, and then there was people that went the administration went and kind of put into those. So they've already kind of admitted that. Sarah,
Mhm.
I guess though my question is, does there always have to be this kind of paper trail to kind of prove your point on this, or can it be that the chief of staff or whoever it is has had a verbal agreement with the president who said, okay, yeah, you can go and do that auto pen? Are there rules there? And is that something that has to be kind of clarified going forward so that we do know who's making the decisions and we do know what the paper trail is?
The reason why you need a paper trail is for the exact scenario that Joe Biden is in right now. If someone questions the validity of a pardon, you have to be able to demonstrate that the president himself signed or otherwise directly authorized every single pardon.
But
Other
aren't we in kind of uncharted waters here though in the
We are,
pardon
and that's why
system?
I would actually
Yeah.
I was going to disagree a little bit with Caitlin
Uh-huh.
because I agree with you that the executive orders are more or less a distraction. And the reason why the conversation keeps coming back to the clemency orders is a couple of things. One, that was a period where we know that Joe Biden was in the worst, lowest point of his cognitive decline, right? He very
Mhm.
clearly deteriorated from 2021, from the midterms. By the end of his presidency, we know he was like falling down the stairs. He couldn't form sentences. It was a disaster. So we know from publicly available evidence that this was the point where his mental acuity was the weakest, just chronologically for his presidency. And also, there's a lot of stuff that the president does that other government agencies can do, other cabinet members, that Congress can do, that judges can do. The one thing that the Constitution says only the president can do, he alone, is a pardon. And so that is why there's so much focus on the legality of those. Using the auto pen to sign legislation, to sign proclamations, that sort of thing. If, we've talked about this before, if his aides were putting out tweets in his name that he didn't really authorize, maybe unethical, not illegal. When it comes to the pardon power, if Joe Biden wasn't intimately involved in approving each and every pardon, that opens them up to, as you correctly identify, as unprecedented legal challenges, because we've never really had this situation
Mhm.
before. But it's the auto pen use for one of the most isolated, discrete presidential powers that's enumerated in the Constitution is a big deal. And that's why we're talking about AutoPen for the pardons in terms of anything that the Trump DOJ or any private litigator is going to be able to get thrown out. That's the weakest point in terms of executive actions authorized or not authorized by Joe Biden.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to kind of do a bit of, oh well, where does this take us now and what we're in what are we going to do in future administrations? But there does seem to be genuinely a kind of a need for at least guardrails or kind of checks and balances on this power because we're seeing Trump kind of go and pardon people now, albeit you can see it on camera because he's doing it on camera all the time. He is actually
That's the
signing
point
it.
in the Constitution.
But
It's supposed to be an unchecked power. That is why it's so crucial to get to the bottom of it, right? It's one of the only expressly unchecked powers that the president has. Even his war powers are checked, right?
Mhm.
Almost
yeah,
everything else is checked. This is the framers very specifically didn't check this one.
yeah.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and that's actually, to put a finer point on it, I that's what's going to be like the biggest mystery, I think, about what the DOJ does in response to this report, because from what I saw in the report, there wasn't any recommendation that the committee was actually making as far as what the policy should be going forward. Obviously, if you read between the lines, the overarching argument is that using the auto pen is bad because stuff like this can happen, where we don't know perhaps who actually got the assent from the man in charge. But I do find it interesting, or I will be looking out to see whether the DOJ, this DOJ by under Pam Bondi, decides maybe they want to revise the 2005 Office of Legal Counsel memo that sort of gave presidents a lot of broad abilities to use the auto pen. We didn't see, that permission really acted upon until Obama, who even himself didn't do the auto pen really at all, except on on an occasion or so. It wasn't really until Joe Biden that we saw this great, abuse, I would argue, of the auto pen go into play. And now we find ourselves in this situation where, yeah, we had a memo in 2005 that said it was okay, but maybe they didn't actually anticipate, having to use, the soup comparison again, soup for brain president. So I think that that's basically, I would love to see if there's going to be any recommendations going forward about how president, if a president can even use an auto pen, if the DOJ might, backtrack on its recommendation. That would be very interesting to find out.
yeah, I think what's kind of look, setting aside the abuse of this or alleged abuse, and what the DOJ is going to do, I think there's two parallel tracks here because and they're tied together, but one talking about Biden's decline and this alleged cover-up. And I think it was interesting that that House Oversight zeroed in on several figures who had kind of pled the fifth during their testimony with House Oversight. Some people were more cooperative than others. Others just simply pled the fifth, and they've asked the DOJ to look further into them. One of them is Kevin O'Connor, who was Biden's personal physician. Uh, One could argue that perhaps he didn't want to say anything because of patient-doctor confidentiality, but they seem to have zeroed in on him, and in fact, they have asked the medical board to investigate him as well, and perhaps see the revocation of his license. Um, but I guess I want to kind of get at what are your thoughts like on the doctor and senior members of staff, whether did they do right by Joe Biden, or do you think they all felt that they were kind of he was their meal ticket and they needed to keep this going as long as they possibly could? Or I'm curious to know if you have any kind of insights or thoughts as to what their thought process was here, if they thought the jig was up, or and they could ride it out another 4 years, or did they maybe not see that this was a problem right in front of their own face?
There's so much in that, right? Because doing right by Joe Biden is sort of one thing, right? Doing right by the country is like a different competing question with
Oh, for
that.
sure, yeah.
And then you also have to sort of rewind back last year, when conversations started having, certainly in our publication, and they were confined to conservative media at the time in early 2024, the idea that you could just switch Biden out at the top of the ticket was unheard of. It had never been done in modern politics. There was no mechanism for it. There was no concept of how that could even work. And so if you were a Democrat and Donald Trump was increasingly looking like your opponent and you really believe that Donald Trump is like a threat to democracy or whatever, then you might feel that you have a moral obligation to conceal that sort of weakness for the good of the country in a twisted way, you
Mm.
know? So that is possibly what was at play with these aides, the other two who were referred to the DOJ, specifically Anthony Bernal and Annie Tomasini. These were not just hired guns, political operatives from the Democratic Party machine. These were people who had been with the Biden family in power, out of power, every single day. They essentially were like adopted family, and by all accounts, extremely fiercely loyal. So you also had that sort of personal attachment
Well,
there.
well, to that point though, I think one thing that I found quite interesting this week was there was a video that was released, I believe, as part of this. Alex Thompson, who of course wrote the book about Biden's decline, along with Jake Tapper. It was a video of Mike Donnellan,
Yeah.
who was on camera, was asked about whether he had any financial incentive to get Biden reelected. And Donnellan, who I think is supposed to be seen as somebody who's quite loyal to the Bidens as well, said that he was going to get a $4 million bonus if he was going to get Biden reelected. So is it that they're fiercely loyal to Joe Biden, or is it that they're fiercely loyal to the bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the financial ties with all these assistants to the president, including the doctor, I think really sort of accentuate why this is kind of a deeper element of the scandal here. And I'm glad that the Oversight Committee latched onto this in their report because, it notes specifically that O'Connor had business dealings and financial connections to the Biden's family. Like you were saying, Donilon, stood to, make potentially a couple of million to 4 million from his from Biden's potential success with his campaign. So all of this compiles on itself for these people who are so loyal to Biden. Obviously, some of them might just be completely enamored with the president for whatever reason and think that he's just the greatest and should have been the candidate through the whole process. But others, I think, as we can see, stood to gain something beyond just keeping their jobs, maybe even getting a little bit more than just keeping their jobs and getting higher payouts. So I think that this is an interesting element that the committee has focused on and has asked the DOJ to look into, especially as it relates to the alleged financial ties between O'Connor and Biden himself, and they've been they've known each other for a long time, and he's Biden's been his his patient. So I think that'll be an interesting element to this as well, because it seems like the DOJ is adamant about looking into every aspect of this report. So I don't know how long it's going to take though. That's the thing is like, and we didn't really even get a proper like you know, boilerplate, you know, like we are investigating kind of thing. It was just sort of Bondi saying like we are looking at this. You know, it
Right.
was a very sort of informal tweet that she made after the report came out.
Sort of like we are looking at the Jeffrey Epstein files,
You're right on top of it.
that sort of thing. I mean, I guess that's a good question. You might already have answered it, to be honest, Kaylin, on what are the next steps? I mean, what would they be looking at? Would it be a conspiracy, or, gosh, I don't even know. I mean, what are we? Is there anything, Sarah? Is there anything that you can kind of see potentially in the future, or is it just too vague right now to even kind of mount an educated speculation?
Yeah, I defer to Kaylin on this one, but again, I go back to this like January 6th analogy of it feels really dirty and like somebody should be held accountable, but it's not clear that any criminal statutes were violated other than, you know, if they could get someone on a process crime while looking into this, which is what they did to the Trump people. If someone lies under oath, for example, destroys documents, that sort of thing. But it's not a crime to be really loyal to your boss and, you know, keep his secrets and that sort of thing. So I would defer to Kalen, maybe he does, but I think it's not a clear-cut crime here.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I'll make this the last thing I say before we get into Arctic frost, so we can spend you know a good 10 minutes on that. But to this point, the committee's referral, I mean, some people might mince the words and say that they made a criminal referral. They actually didn't make any type of criminal referrals at all. They just asked the DOJ to take a look into the three Tomasini, O'Connor, and Bernal to identify whether there was any you know criminal activity or criminal actions that they may have committed relating to their time when they were in office. So it's not like, oh, we think that they did this criminal act or that criminal act. It's just like, hey, could you check in and do a little deeper look based off of, you know, the resources that you all have to see if there's anything there. And so that's a little bit less, you know, as we know, than a criminal referral. So that's why, you know, the fact that the lawmakers are sort of saying like, you guys do it, you know, you guys, you know, be the ones to do this.
But
They don't,
forgive me.
they don't really know, perhaps.
Forgive me, doesn't that you know, setting up our next section particularly well here, doesn't that sound like a bit of a fishing expedition that that they might be embarking on?
Well, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
it
I
seems.
think from the civil perspective, maybe the best bet is that they might take a look from the civil litigation side. What could we do to challenge the legality of the pardons in a way that sets a precedent, which is what we're talking about? You might need a binding judicial
Mhm.
precedent to avoid this sort of situation, and that wouldn't be a criminal process.
Yeah. Well, look, speaking of fishing expeditions, as I said, the other big story this week, and again, I feel like it's just kind of keeps going under the radar because it's never the sort of top story of the day, but it's maybe the second or third, is the ongoing Arctic frost investigation. And there was a pretty big development this week, and Kaylin, perhaps you'd like to kind of elaborate a little bit on what that was and where we kind of find ourselves with what is turning out to be, you know, not the best look for the justice system.
Mhm. Well, so 30-second background. I mean, of course, Arctic Frost was the investigation that started under former FBI agent Timothy Thibault under the Ray FBI, and that culminated into Special Counsel Jack Smith's 2020 elections indictment, all the evidence that was collected throughout it. And we reported earlier this year, a couple months ago, about a month and a half, about the you know the scope of Arctic Frost. That there was around a total of 92 conservative groups, individuals that were looked into, had their financial records subpoenaed. Well, this week it was made clear through the help of new FBI records and whistleblower accounts that the scope of Arctic frost is much broader than what was previously reported. It amounted to you know around 200 subpoenas in total that Jack Smith had logged to try to get more information as he was developing his 2020 electors case against Trump. And what we find out is that there's basically the entire conservative apparatus that was supporting Trump at the time, his comeback reelection bid, and just names and groups of individuals that you couldn't imagine really being investigated by the FBI. What we know as well is that it spanned multiple field offices across the entire country. The one that we homed in on with the Examiner and our reporting was really focused on the Seattle field offices talk about the Conservative Partnership Institute, their head Ed Corrigan, and some of the things that the Seattle field office was vetting leads that were alleging that Corrigan had these ties to foreign interests like Russia, and saying that he was, had sort of a interest in instigating civil war and all these very odd, bizarre things. I mean, I've never met Mr. Corrigan, but you take one look at some of the people who do know him. I've been tweeting about it the last couple of days, and they're just like, this is beyond insane for anyone to be alleging these types of ideas are coming out of Corrigan's brain. So, leave that to him to respond. He hasn't, responded to our request for comment yet, but it is very interesting that all these people, the Bannons of the world, the former DOJ officials who were discussing some of the 2020 election problems with the White House at the time. I'm blanking on his name right now. You know who I'm talking about, Sarah. Who was raided
Probably
with
need
his.
more info on that.
He was raided. Jeff Clark. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Oh,
Jeff
great.
Clark, and also
We could do a whole
uh,
video about
Peter,
what they did to Jeff Clark.
Peter
Give me a
Navarro.
good
Yeah,
30 minutes.
so many people, so many people. Basically, the entire Trump apparatus was tapped. I thought the most interesting one. Did you guys see what Ted Cruz was saying yesterday at the press conference?
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
Judge Boasberg strikes again.
yeah. So
for
so
those
Ted
uninitiated,
Cruz.
why don't you remind us?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of like tee up. So basically, Ted Cruz was talking about the phone tolls that were, essentially collected on he and some other senators, about 8 senators, 1 representative, and they were talking about the discrepancies between how certain phone carriers were handling subpoenas that were sent by Jack Smith. Verizon was the one carrier that was basically just handing over the records when they were sought, but Ted Cruz comes out on the podium and talks about the experience that Smith had with AT&T, and essentially he's saying AT&T rejected the records that were being sought on Ted Cruz's phone. But what was more interesting is that Cruz is saying that the that that the judge that was handling the subpoena request, Judge James Boasberg, had said that there was a concern that the party that was being investigated might tamper with or sort of maybe destroy some evidence related to the phone records. That's referring to Cruz, and so he basically blocked AT&T from being able to tell Cruz that his phone records were being sought after. But AT&T obviously ultimately declined to cooperate with that request. But it was just a very bizarre sort of allegation that Cruz was making yesterday, and really does show. I mean, we're talking about Ted Cruz here. He's not really. I mean, a lot of people in the Republican movement kind of see him as on the softer end of some of the more the things that the left gripes about. So I mean, for Ted Cruz of all people to be roped into this, it really just seemed like they were that Smith was going after anyone that supported Trump, anyone who had any inkling of support for him. Was seen as necessary to help create this indictment against him in Washington, D.C.
Sarah, what are your thoughts on how Smith seems to be kind of handling this? I mean, he seems to be willing to have his day in the sun and explain everything, but it reminds me of those moments when people demand a debate just because they feel like they want that airtime and that airspace. I mean, look, what do you think's going on here, and how this kind of resolves itself? Or are we tip of the iceberg here and there's just going to be way more embarrassing revelations to come?
I have a sense this is just the tip of the iceberg because this was a years-long investigative effort. It took millions of dollars, like Kaylin mentioned. It spanned almost all the field offices that the FBI has, it seemed, multiple U.S. attorneys' offices. I mean, this was really wide-ranging, and we have just like a tiny little stack of documents so far about how this was run. And this does go beyond Jack Smith because this started before he got to the DOJ,
Hmm.
before there was a clear idea of what the prosecution would look like. It definitely seems, by all accounts, that the DOJ decided, let's get these guys, let's go find something, let's investigate the entire conservative movement. And I think there's a few next questions, but one of the most immediate ones is, did this corrupt DOJ plant the seeds of additional prosecutions at the state level? We saw prosecutions of Donald Trump and his associates in Georgia in Fani Willis's office, and there were some unexplained coordination between the DOJ and the Fulton County District Attorney's Office that both sides denied, but that was always a little fishy. That probably would have been explored had that gone to trial. You had election-related prosecutions in Arizona. Donald Trump wasn't among them, but people on that list from the DOJ certainly were. And
Hmm.
you also had the Michigan Attorney General attempt to prosecute some of these people who were caught up in what appears to be this dragnet from the FBI in early 2022. And a judge, that's the only one that a judge looked at that and threw it out. And so if there was this sort of collusion between the Biden DOJ and state prosecutors for charges that a future president couldn't undo with a pardon, and this sort of really shady way to kind of try to bleed this movement dry by dragging all of the people who were involved in it into various prosecutions across different states. I mean, the next question is are we seeing the foundations of that being laid? We don't know yet.
Well, I think we'll have to answer that the next time that we meet, or several different ones. But for now, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Uh, I could have spoken to you two for hours about these two things today, but unfortunately, that's not realistic. Thank you, everybody, for joining us once again. Please like and subscribe, share these videos, give us replies, comments, everything and everything in between. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.